I just wanted to mention that we've broken down the chat into two sections today. We've got my section, which is a little bit more philosophical. I'm looking at sociological concepts and psychological concepts and trying to figure out what the background is from a humanities perspective as to what good behavior actually is. So we ask a lot of questions, and the idea that we're trying to put forward is not necessarily to answer any of these questions, but to figure out whether the questions themselves are the right ones. And yeah, on that, something that I absolutely love about the humanities is that there is actually no right answer to a question. It's just a series of paradigms, each of which offer their own flavor of approaching the resolutions to a question. So we're going to start by going through just a handful of different perspectives that may offer an answer to the question, or maybe just a different setting of it. And then how we can define that within a business setting or in a business perspective. So in this discussion, we'll first be talking through a series of questions to explore behavior. And then, yeah, like I said, I'll hand over to Eric after that. All right, so the first question that we've got for you guys is good behavior determined by context. So humans consider their own good behavior in terms of, or at least from a number of different sources. So if they consider good behavior at all, that is. These could be based on external motivators like societal, historical, cultural contexts, or possibly the internal motivators that influence our perceptions, or the drivers that make up our own self-ideations or morals. And basically, good behavior could be viewed sociologically or psychologically. So we can just run through a few examples of what these different perspectives could be. A first one, which is quite common, as everybody will know, but more in the light of bad behaviors, is peer pressure. So peer groups have been long known to influence the behavior of individuals, especially at certain relevant social milestones in a human's life. Good behavior is ultimately informed by what others consider to be good, and you feel the need to respond to that. So in this sense, the behaviors can be influenced by social or the peer expectations. So such as being pressured into performing well in school, to match up with a friend's high performance, to get into the same university, or even living up to the standards of a colleague or a partner to either outperform them or to find common ground. You find a baseline then to base your good behaviors on. Another example of perception enforcing good behavior stems from the rules of authority, which is what was mentioned just now as well. I think also with regards to that peer pressure, so how you look outward, that reputational aspect that you have associated with yourself is then managed by other people. So a great example of this is the panopticon, which was designed by Jeremy Bentham, and it relies on the gaze of authority to maintain a higher level of good behavior. In this case, obviously, in prisoners. So the watchtower is constructed in the center of the prison, and the guards can see into all the cells, but the prisoners can't see the guards. So the prisoners behave according to the rules laid out by the authorities watching them, because they're never quite sure when or how they're being watched. And that then enforces the good behaviors that they perform. So in this way, the context within which a human resides then enforces how they behave, whether they innately want to or not. So defining good behavior it can be defined through normalization of actions and the choices that you make. So humans are taught basically the right things to do by their parents or neighbors or often teachers or even friend groups, which are ultimately their cultural counterparts. So it makes sense, therefore, that culture informs good behavior because humans are ultimately social beings. They like to be part of a group and will therefore live up to the expectations of that group. This then leads over to another perspective, which looks at the psychological drivers of good behavior, whether they're either learned or discovered. So psychological influences of good behavior are linked very often to learned behaviors, but within a cultural setting. And they often go one step further to help us gain a view or a greater perspective about how the individual feels about the behaviors they're performing, whether they're good or not. Because while humans do have the capacity to do things they don't strictly want to do, there should be some inner driving force that helps them maintain those good behaviors, even if they don't, strictly speaking, want to do them. Now, everyone's familiar with Freud, and he comes, well, he's got a few good examples of how this is the psychological drivers of good behavior. So Freud stipulates that in generally sophisticated society, the needs and desires of an individual will often contradict what society expects. And thus the individual has to suppress their taboo ideas and their personal desires. And it is this suppression that is good behavior. The fact that you are living up to what you are expected to live up to, despite the fact that it's going against your innate natural desires, because desires of humanity are according to Freud, often quite messy and a little bit otherwise, whereas society is sophisticated and teaches you how you should be good, erring away from the things that are bad. Now, another good example of this comes from a case study that I came across in university. So a group of psychologists were interested in studying the practice of consanguinity, which is the incestuous marriage of cousins. So they studied two neighboring villages, one of which shared most Western societies' perspectives on incest, which is that it's relatively abhorrent, whereas the other village was common practice to engage in incestual marriage. If you were to take an individual from each of these villages and you were to put them in the opposite context, what they understand about what good behavior is would be completely different, strictly directly related to that concept. And in this way, we can look at Charles Darwin, who is in the picture that you guys can see now. So he was actually married to his first cousin. I don't know if anybody knows this, but they ended up having 10 children together. And they lost 3 of these children in their lifetime, as often people did in those days. But the more that Darwin started to do his research on evolution, he began to question whether the deaths of his children were due to the fact that he had married incestually. And he began to question what he thought was originally normal or good behavior and start to view it from a bad perspective. The choices that Darwin made were initially, like I said, common practice, but he then had to shift his own perspective of what was good behavior based on what he learned subsequent to what he'd been taught. So does good behavior depend entirely on the context of a situation, or is it that there is a universal truth of good? Humanity, from this perspective, they choose to make their decisions that reflect good behavior and that are often informed by a globally or a universally accepted truth, that these are the right things to do and these are the wrong things to do. So the informers of what we understand about universal truths are often based in religion, but they can also be from schools of thought or just general like social philosophies. What I find is actually very interesting to look at each of these different schools and see the somewhat common ties between each of them, but also the very sort of disparate ideas around the basis of what not necessarily just drives behavior, but also enforces that good behavior. You know, these universal truths will often cross the cultural boundaries, and like Buddhism is a great example from a starting point, that the common practice means ensuring the livelihood and existence of all living creatures. That's what they base being good on. And we do take I think everybody takes a certain portion of that and carries it forward. So what they believe is that we all live alongside one another and therefore all living beings should be treated equally. So another perspective comes from Jeremy Bentham, who, as I stated earlier, he created the panopticon. He states in the very simplest way that good behavior is merely the set of actions that benefit the majority of everybody involved. in whatever that choice needs to be. Stoicism, which is an old Greek philosophy, takes that whole idea one step further and says that you need to make sure that what you do on a daily basis lives up to the virtues of wisdom and courage and justice and moderation. And that even if you don't wish to take certain actions, if they are the right thing to do, then you must do them. Now, these philosophies are more on the sort of good side of it, but you can also look at the counter of that. Nietzsche is a very popular example. So his concepts of good behavior are embedded in the idea of power, really, that if you wish to do good, you must make sure that that good will enforce some concept of power or provide you with power or has the opposite of anything that is considered to be weak. So weakness is then ultimately considered to be bad. And the last example is the polar to Stoicism, which is obviously hedonism. I think it was popularized in the 60s. I could be wrong about that. But it's a school of thought that's based on the personal pursuit of pleasure. So whatever it is that you desire, whatever it is that you need to do to ensure your own personal happiness, that is good behavior. So the contextual and the universal truths and philosophies aside, all right, could behavior actually purely be defined by the spaces within which those behaviors are condoned? So environments have the ability to influence behavior for a number of reasons. It could be that a combination of the environment itself and the occupants enforce the behaviors that are good and then err away from the behaviors which affect the space and the occupants in any kind of negative way. A great example of this, which I'm sure a lot of you will know well enough, is that like in the evolution or in various different workspaces, there's often been various behaviors that accompany them, even if they are somewhat similar spaces, in this case being workspaces. So good behavior in the cubicle generation. So I've been told, it's a little before my time, but so I've been told that fish was an absolute no-go during lunch. You should never bring fish to work out of respect for everybody else within that environment. Now, in underground, it is common knowledge that you don't light a match, but you're welcome to eat all the fish you want. In a co-op working space, good behavior would mean not necessarily farting in front of everyone for fear of distressing everyone in the room. You need to be aware of the people that you're around and the fact that you don't know any of these people. And now, with all of us in an online setting, it's considered good behavior to turn your microphone off while somebody is presenting, or in some cases to put the little hand up when you want to. But then the question comes in, like, is it good behavior to have your camera on or to have it off? And that seems to be a deeper sort of contextual environment within this greater environment that we're in, depending on the people that you're speaking to or whether you know them, or also based on your own personal concepts of good behavior. So it could also be said that the spaces enforce good behaviors because of the rules that are put in place by the authorities that govern those spaces. Again, remember the panopticon. So while that example gave us a view on why the prisoners behaved well, it didn't necessarily tell you what those behaviors are. But if we think about it in terms of a school as a great example of this, a teacher will determine the boundaries of behavior in order to be good for the class, as in the rest of the students in that class, and for the learning environment, and also for herself, and to ensure the value and the reason for the existence of that space originally. So it's ultimately then her responsibility as the head of that space to ensure that the good behavior is tailored for the benefit of everybody within that space. So could we assume then that good behavior comes from the rules that are designed for any environment, whether it be, home or school? But then also, what about the behaviors that are then adopted in spaces that have no definitive or at least outlined authority, and yet humans will still adopt behaviors that are expected within that space, oftentimes through watching others' behaviors? So if you consider the behaviors that change from when you are in your own home to when you are in a friend's home to when you are in an acquaintance's home or even a colleague's home, each of those new spaces will bring on new concepts of good behavior. But also in terms of places of worship, very often it's not a case of you are told when you go in there by the person that runs that place of worship, okay, you're not allowed to do this, this or that, and this is considered good behavior. You either pick up on the rhythms of the people around you, or you just know, don't talk too loudly for respect. And the image that I've got over there is from a temple in Shinjuku in Japan. Now, when I was in Japan, what I found very often is that these temples are generally outdoors, so you don't really have that whole keep your indoor voice idea. And they're very often completely empty, depending on which town or which city you're in. But it doesn't really change the fact that the moment you enter that space, your demeanor changes. You're no longer necessarily just who you are, but you'll abide by what is expected of you within that space, even if there is no one there to see you. And sometimes what happens is people will then try to participate in the actions that other people perform within that space. And I think that is especially when nobody else is there watching you. Then we've got the question of intent versus outcome. So it's a very complicated question. So is good behavior, or at least a complicated series of questions. So is good behavior directly linked to the good intentions of an individual, despite the possibility of bad outcomes? Or is it that good is only good when the outcome or the result of which is deemed to be good? So even if those intentions could be shady. As mentioned, Freud talks about that suppression of personal desires to conform to social contexts. And the emphasis of which is that good behavior is described almost entirely in favor of the outcome, because you never know, well, at least according to Freud, you never really know what the true intentions are subconsciously, sometimes not even in yourself, but you are still expected to uphold this outcome, this idea, this thing that you need to live up to. But, you know, is it that you could also have bad intentions for doing this thing, so you'd like to just make sure that you're seen to be doing good? Or perhaps you could consider altruism. There's a great question that's asked in, I think, all psychological circles, I think in all philosophical circles, is that according to, I can't recall who spoke about this, but saying that altruism is not actually, or at least charity is not necessarily charity at all, because the people that participate in charitable activities are often doing so for their own selfish reasons, for their own selfish intentions. So does that actually matter? Does the fact that that person is doing it to make themselves feel better, does that diminish the good that they do outwardly? So in the same way, it can be looked at on the flip side. So if somebody is trying very hard to do the right thing, but they're not necessarily achieving that right thing. The picture that I've got there is because this phrase kept popping into my head, which I'm sure everybody will know, and I would laugh if everybody's also had this, but the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Now, I came across a quote that Pablo Picasso actually put down, where he said that what one does is what counts, not what one had the intentions of doing. Now, that I think can be called very much into question if you look at, does this really still apply in today's society, or in our new, or at least updated concepts of what good behavior is? Because, I mean, if somebody is, or if you look at it, instead of saying intend, you could say try. Does it matter that you're trying to do good, even if by some consequence the outcome of that doing good is not really so favorable? Like in terms of a revolution, if we look at that as very vague example of this. In revolutions, the intentions of the group are to create a change, and generally for good, for the people that are within that revolution. So to look for some new form of freedom, or to find a break away from old or constrictive regimes. Now, the revolution itself will not always pan out the way that it's supposed to, and there's often going to be a series of waves. So the outcome is not always a good one. There'll be deaths involved, there'll be a number of mishaps that happen. But does that mean that the revolutionaries should give up what they're doing, or should they stick to that because of their own internal knowledge that what they are doing is actually good? And is it good because it's good for a vast number of people that are part of that revolution? And should they keep doing it because they will, if they are deemed right in the end, they will succeed? But even then, what is right? So I'm going to leave these questions here for you guys to think about. I think we'll probably end up having a bit of a conversation on it a little bit later. And these different perspectives are to help offer various different viewpoints on answering the same grand question of what is good behavior really? But how does this factor into business?
So I thought it would be useful to maybe look at an example of where these principles and questions are useful to think about in a sort of corporate setting. Look at the question of what is good customer behavior. So the specific thing we're going to look at is wellness programs. So a growing number of companies are developing or implementing some sort of wellness program globally, and there's a whole range of reasons for doing that. I think part of it is companies now have a lot of pressure to act in a sort of socially responsible way, and those programs range in depth from education to giving people information and scores and things, to giving them incentives, and are integrated into businesses to different degrees, but there's a lot of them being developed and that are developed are being evolved, and it's across different spaces. So there's physical wellness and financial wellness and mental wellness. It's a very large sort of focus area at the moment, and I think potentially a question that doesn't get thought enough about when people are designing these programs is what you need to consider about good behavior. Like this broader question that we're asking of what is good behavior, how does everything that Jess spoke about, how can that inform your design of the wellness program? And, of course, there are many different factors that go into the design of a wellness program, and there are a lot of criteria that you need to satisfy, and it depends on the aims of the business and why they're actually building this wellness program, and it's a complicated thing to do, but I do think that part of it should be thinking about what do we mean when we're talking about good behavior. So I think in our experience, almost always when designing a wellness program, people will take the universal truth approach, and it starts from the point of saying that good behavior is performing actions that are good for you because it's a wellness program, and we as a program are going to specify what is good for you as a universal truth. And it is similar in a way to the spaces and environments discussion that we were talking about, in that, and I mean, people don't have to come into your space. It's generally an opt-in sort of thing, but you are the authority in the space setting those rules for good behavior. And I think it's important to think about, just think about the fact that you are taking this approach of saying there is a universal view of good behavior, and being aware that potentially you are selecting that universal view given your context. I think one of the interesting things that Jess was showing is that there are so many potential universal truths, and I think it's easy to select the one that best fits with your context. And it's worth thinking about this universally true principle that we're putting down. is that going to be the right universal truth to use as the basis for our program? Because when you're building a wellness program, the whole thing really builds off your definition of what is good behavior. I think probably the easiest example is if you're doing a physical wellness program and you want to say to people they need to eat healthily. There are so many different views and versions of what that could mean, and the decision that you make can have a really big impact on how your program looks and what your wellness program is incentivizing. And as the authority figure in that space, you're really, creating the rules and have, I think, a degree of responsibility around the good behavior that you are driving. So there is also, that's the universal approach. There is, I guess, a view you can take of, what more contextual sociological approach would be around, and there are programs that do this around letting people set their own goals. So you do still have to, you can do it to the degree that you want. Like you could maybe say set your own goal on this measure, or just set your own goals and we will help you and encourage you and help you along the way to achieving it. But you must define what good behavior is given your context. Like I say, I think it's worth being aware when you sort of thinking about these programs, which approach you're taking. It's worth being aware of what sort of approach you're taking and the implications that has. Another interesting thing to think about in terms of good behavior is what Jess was talking about with good intentions paving the road to hell. And I think where that comes through in these wellness programs is how do you consider outcomes versus actions? So what I mean by that is if someone is behaving well but isn't actually well, that they're doing what you define as good behavior but they haven't actually reached that point of wellness, what do you do in that situation? And are you defining good behavior as being well or as acting in a way to get you towards well? One example could be, there could be someone who is eating healthily but has some sort of genetic predispositions or conditions, and actually their health costs are pretty high. For your business, if someone has low health costs, there's health costs going down. And, it's fine to make that trade-off. It is a program. Just building these programs, you have to optimize against a number of factors, but it's worth being aware of the fact that you are then saying that, outcomes are more important than intentions to a degree. Another example would be, is it more important that someone is saving every month or that they have a lot of savings? And what happens if someone is saving every month and then, the reason that you save is to have some sort of buffer. There's long-term savings as well, but generally, the first reason that you save is to have a buffer against some unexpected expense coming up, right? So what happens if someone has that unexpected every month and then their car breaks down and they pay for it, but then they don't have a lot of total savings anymore? How do you consider that person as someone who is behaving well? And I think these are all important questions that you have to, so Jess was saying, putting these as open philosophical questions, but I think the hard thing about building out these programs is you actually have to pick an answer, and there's not necessarily one right way of doing it, and you decide, given the context in which you're doing, which way is preferable and what would work best given your situation and your customer's context and everything like that.
Sorry, Eric, you lost me a little bit there, but I was thoroughly getting into it, and then we've gone from a customer. You're saying how does your actions in front of a customer, and then you've gone on to, it sounds like you're saying that an organization needs to reward me to have a wellness center for being good. I'm sorry, I don't know if anybody else, I was following it and then suddenly you lost me. We're talking about how does, in the front of a customer, there's somebody that I deal with, and then it's like something like there's a reward for if I do well at work, then I'm going to have a wellness center as an incentive. I'm sorry, I'm lost. Hope you don't mind me just jumping in.
So I think, so we're saying if the situation we're talking about is if you are a company and you want to encourage customers to behave well, what should you be thinking about in terms of defining good behavior? How does it relate to this discussion, or how can we pull in the points that Jess was raising and the questions that she was asking in order to answer this question of how do we get customers to behave better. And when I spoke about rewards, it's just because, that is one of the mechanisms you can use, but, you don't need to, it's not important. I think what is more important is, how do you think about these questions that Jess was asking in the context of trying to change a customer's behavior in order for them to be more well. And what I was trying to say on this slide in particular was that you need to think about how important you think intentions are versus outcomes in terms of encouraging someone to be well and to behave in a good way, however you define that. So do you define good being having good intentions or good having good outcomes? And
outcomes, definitely outcomes, because customers are make demands and want you to do everything, you deliver, but then they don't respond. So for me, a customer needs to I need an outcome from a customer, which then comes into a form as reward for me, be it commission or success or status or whatever the case is. I definitely need an outcome from a customer.
Yeah, so I think it can depend on the context that you're acting in. So I think it sounds like for you it's very clear that the outcome is the most important thing. But if someone is, they really want to give you an outcome, and that's not in your context, but I'm sure you can imagine in a different context. If someone is trying really hard to give you an outcome, and for some reason beyond their control it doesn't work out, are they then, in your context they are, but there are so many different situations in which this can happen that it's just worth thinking about how you think about it.
I don't know if it's behaving badly. If there's no value for the customer in something, it's not behaving. Remember, it can be broken down into multiple facets, from financial remuneration, credibility, legacy, brand, whatever. I don't think it's going to be bad. It's just, we didn't come to an arrangement, so it doesn't mean he's behaving badly.
Yeah. Exactly, and then you need to think about. So if you do have like some incentive structure or program or something where doesn't work out, you're saying that person didn't behave badly. What does that mean in terms of your interactions with them because you didn't get the outcome?
I chastise them and lock them up in a dark room with duct tape. I don't know.
Put them in a panopticon until they give you the result.
A sensory deprivation tank. I don't know.
So then, I think the last piece, and this is more for dealing with consumers. So as a corporate dealing with consumers, so you say you're a bank or an insurance company, and you're wanting to encourage good behavior. So you've answered all of these different questions. We know what we think good behavior is, or what we're going to say good behavior is, and what we want to incentivize. It can then be very difficult to, and there's a range of different ways, or with trade-offs, of how you can find evidence of behavior in people's interaction data with you. And there's different, like I said, trade-offs in the approach that you choose. And the first one is that it's easy to quantify good behavior from the data that you have available. And that's great and very exciting, but it doesn't often. So another option is you could use self-reporting using surveys. The downside is that you're probably not going to get that many people answering, and if they do answer, you need to adjust for how much you trust what they're saying. Especially in a good behavior space, people tend to over-report how well they're quite consistently. So you can adjust for that, but you need to somehow figure out what that adjustment should. You can't say, almost assume that if someone's justification for doing it's actually not going to be completely true as well. So you have to make that trade-off of how willing are you to get it wrong, how wrong will it be, how many of the dimensions can you measure. Or you can look for other proxies of good behavior in the data. So someone who we believe that someone who is behaving well will have this sort of characteristic, and we can see that because they You need to be able to say why you're using this proxy. Is it an internal measure? How explainable and justifiable does it need to be? And then the last option is to build models to approximate the data that you don't have on good behavior. So to either use some sort of training set or like expert knowledge to build out some training set and use a modeling approach to approximate good behavior using missing data. I think that's the end of what we prepared. So hopefully that last piece was just sort of a useful potential application of Jess's very interesting discussion around what good behavior can mean, and showing that, thinking about that is actually practically useful. And there's obviously a lot of other ways that it's useful, but I'm sure, hopefully there's a few questions and things that people want to discuss. So we'll open up the floor and end the formal presentation piece of the session.
Thanks, Eric. Jess, I really enjoyed that. I'm hoping that there's some interesting questions. Peter's already kicked us off with some thought-provoking questions. Thanks, Peter.
I feel like there's some other forces at work.
Somebody must behave badly, please. Start off. Somebody just behave badly. I love conversations about behavior and how it is. My general stance is in life is if you're polite in starting with me, I'm polite following on with you. You will get a reaction from me based on how you start a conversation. I know that's pretty vague, but a simple hello, a thank you, it gets so much from me. If you walk into a room full of aggression, you're going to find it back. You're going to get it back. So, for me, it's about starting. It's about how you start. And I'm so into the Hinduism part, and what was the other one?
The hedonism.
There was three. There was three. The first one, the middle one, and the last one. Hinduism. What was the one at the top, Jess, on the right?
On the top right, that was Stoicism.
Yeah. Yes, I'm so into Stoic as well, from How to Train Your Dragon and all of that. And then the first one, I like the
Buddhism,
first one. So, yeah.
Where did you put your hand up?
Sorry.
No stress.
Well, I was wondering about the need for the qualification of good and bad. I mean, I'm all for good, but as Jess stated, it's subjective. And so how much does saying that something's good or bad, which can change over time and has historically, matter next to whatever the desired objective is? How does that cloud it or modify the act or the measurement?
I think that's linked to what we were talking about with regards to intention and outcome. I think that the measurement of good, and it's funny because you can't really measure good without understanding bad, and it's something that I actively try to stay away from in this exploration, is to not, because very often when you ask somebody what's good behavior, they'll tell you what's bad and they'll say, okay, it's the opposite of that. Because good is normally just what we consider to be normal, because what we consider to be acceptable. But if you're trying to bring that into a machine space, I mean, especially when you're trying to, like I was saying earlier, trying to understand how to understand humans through this artificial intelligence space, you need to know what those gauges are. You need to know what those points are that you can ultimately measure. And that measurement will help you define things like your wellness programs, or also just to understand the actions and the interactions of a person, to help to define their personalities a little better.
I see it's kind of like a third measurement in my mind, when I break it down, because as a company, just as a person, are you aligned with what you do? Like, you could be a Hindu but not practice good Hinduism. And so by breaking it apart from the objective, you get to expose the alignment to that, and also be able to measure that success over time as it changes or with individual or organization objectives.
I think it very much then depends on why you're doing it. I guess a prelude to all of this could be, well, why do you want to understand good behavior? When I came up with the question of what does good behavior really look like, it's related to trying to understand the patterns of human interactions, really, through transactions, through data points. Like, at what point can you say to someone, listen, I can see that you're possibly getting into some sort of trouble? Something that's fascinated me quite a lot lately is how people have used artificial intelligence to help with the diagnosis of mental illness. There was a study done a little while ago where they took 50 participants of people who had a family history of schizophrenia, and they started tracking them over a space of, I'm pretty sure it was about 10 years, during that time where the onset of schizophrenia normally happens. And they tracked their texts to one another, and they managed to pick up, before these people knew that they were falling into that, they managed to pick up the schizophrenia before they had the break, which saved their mental states. It obviously got them involved in those programs beforehand as well. But so how do you see and how do you define what that point is? What is good behavior? Obviously, you can't always do this with just 50 participants, because there you know who they are initially, and you can account for the fact that they change in like over time through age and different life stages. But how could you apply the same sort of concept on a much broader theory or in a much broader way to see like how are people doing well in comparison to when are you maybe not going to be doing so well anymore?
But won't there be similarities? People with schizophrenia all have something similar to each other. It's like we're all human. We're all similar in so many ways, but different star signs have different strengths. But we all are human in the beginning. I don't know.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, this is why we're trying to define what is that good behavior initially. What is that normal?
Well, when in Rome, do as Romans do. You know? just dawdle along, and then until something offends you or your family, then respond accordingly. I don't mean it in a physical way, but it's just when you're in Rome, you walk around like a tourist with a camera on and you take photos until you've been there long enough, and then you fit in. I don't know.
So how do you fit that into a business?
Everybody.
Like, how do you fit that into a business context? Is it then like the question around, is it your responsibility as a company to define certain rules and a certain set of behaviors that are considered to be good and behaviors that are considered to be bad? Or is it your responsibility as the customer to pay attention to who the individual is and then design yourself around that?
But hang on, are you talking around a company that's selling something? You can define your knowledge of what you're selling, or what are you saying there? Go back.
I'm saying, is it your responsibility then as the company to define what you consider to be those good behaviors, or should you be looking at the people and redefining your concepts of good behavior based on them, just as an idea? Peter, you also had your hand up.
Whenever. No one's going to jump in.
Yeah, just jump in.
Oh, very good. I've got to jump off here at 8 o'clock, so I just wanted to weigh in a little bit. I just finished writing a book called The Second Civil War, which is a citizen's guide to healing our fractured nation. And I really had to ask myself this question, especially in the United States of America, where we have friends who are aligned with different political parties and oftentimes, in my opinion, behaving incredibly badly. And oftentimes behaving in a way that is inconsistent, I think, even what isn't their own best interest. I'm not nearly as learned or trained as everyone else, and I kind of oversimplify things. And in my very, very oversimplified way, I think we believe to belong and we behave to belong. We are herd animals, and we try to behave in a way that other people accept us as one of their peers. And so I think that affects the way our manners are, our dress is. And especially here in America, we increasingly have more and more tribal badges. And tribal badges can be very physical. It can be as simple as a pin, or if I see anybody with a flag anywhere on their car or dress or clothing today, it signifies to me their political allegiances. We become very, very acute to those things. And it also has to do with the things that people say. So now I can pick up in conversations talking points that are being fed down from the top. And if someone uses a talking point, it signals which tribe they belong to. So I think a lot of our beliefs and a lot of our behaviors are driven by our needs to conform with the groups that we are part of. And those behaviors are not always good. They just help you conform.
Oh, I don't like to conform. I don't like to conform.
I'm sorry to just dump it on you and go, but I got a meeting here. Thank you so much. This was really enjoyable. I normally have a meeting at this time. I'm going to have to reschedule it so I can be here more often. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, Peter. Go
Thanks,
well.
Peter.
See you.
Bye.
Cheers.
But I also don't want to be different just to be different, but just to conform for the sake of it. Yeah.
Something came up in the conversation where we had like initially with Jay as well, where he said that, I think he mentioned what it was in the 90s or something, he was involved in companies where innovation was about breaking the rules. And that's ultimately what innovation was. Is you had to take whatever that rule set is and break them, redefine it, and then that is innovation. That's technically bad behavior with what could be, could be. Is it a good outcome? Is it not? Is it a good outcome because the individual wanted it to be that good outcome, or
Airbnb and Uber, I'm guessing a lot of people look up to those companies. They're massive companies, successful companies, but they're actually Uber disambiguate to the taxi industry. You don't have to pay a license fee to certain regulations. Airbnb, you don't have to pay your hotel fees to the regulators. So they did bad behavior, but people think I'm assuming that because they're such wildly popular, successful companies that they are good.
The outcome was brilliant. I think it's brilliant for me as a consumer.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah.
It's good behavior for the people.
For me as a consumer, that's amazing. It's good behavior, yeah.
But what about you as the old taxi driver? The guy that used to.
But then you have to change and modify and carry on and keep evolving. It's no use doing the same thing expecting a different outcome. That's insanity. Change. Become an Uber driver then. Become a better Uber driver. Yeah, no, I love that.
Especially on that side, I think Uber exploded because you'd often get cases of people being scammed, being picked up by taxis in foreign countries to airports, and now it's standard rates. So you never have that issue anymore. So the people using it, great. And the people that were actually behaving badly, but were the only people that were there, or at least available, that then shifted that.
Yeah, can I just try to pick up on a couple of themes here? Reid brought up the question of the subjectivity of value and the relationship between talking about good versus talking about objectives. I just spoke a little bit about the reason for trying to define good behavior rather than bad behavior. And I actually think there's an interesting theoretical theme to discuss in that regard. So when I think about good behavior, I'm quite influenced by the way multi-criteria decision analysts structure their decision problems. So these would typically be problems where there's a fairly big investment decision to make about, say, how to use a massive piece of land, how to utilize that on a national, provincial, perhaps municipal level, or whether or not to build a big nuclear factory. So quite big strategic decisions where there's perhaps many stakeholders and lots of different considerations to take into account, where there's a need to take those considerations into account in a formal matter, have that written down, and then weigh different criteria, different objectives against each other in a manner that's transparent. So that'll often be, sometimes military decisions are made in this way, oftentimes government decisions, big decisions, where there's a need for accountability to get decision analysts to do this type of thing. And so the simplest way to do that, which if it was a really important decision, you wouldn't do it the simple way, but just for the sake of conceptualizing the way of approaching the problem of good, is so you want to know whether it would be good to build a specific nuclear power plant, or which power plant design would be the best to implement. So that's a concrete example. But the way they do it is then they list all kinds of criteria. So for a power plant, you want efficiency in terms of how your fuel is transformed into energy. There's cost considerations, there's environmental considerations, there's the creation of jobs, there's the people who are worried about safety, there are people who are worried about the ugliness of the thing and ruining property values. And so there's just many different stakeholders with many different criteria. And so what they do is they make a list of those criteria, and then they have methods for any given option. So if there's 3 power plants, each power plant needs to be evaluated against each of those criteria. So each would get a safety score, and probably the safety score would be broken down into several sub-scores for safety in terms of, I don't know.
There's only a few countries, Francois, that would fit into and conform to. Most governments would make a decision what's best for the government. That you'd have to go to like Scandinavia, where they think logically and have clean power and burn stuff properly. If you go to America, it's just like whoever comes in first. In South Africa, you're now hitting a topic of a power plant. So maybe it's a bad example in South Africa.
Okay, so I'll grant you that a multi-criteria decision analysis isn't applied always, and like maybe it would be better if it was applied better. I'm just using the theoretical framework of defining a bunch of objectives and then weighing them against each other. So a simple way to weigh them is to take these scores, a safety score, a cost score, an environmental score, and you just weight them like a normal linear equation. And then you take a weighted sum of these scores, and the one with the highest weighted sum is the one that is the best alternative. Now, the point I wanted to get to is, in that case, you're trying to define a good decision because you're trying to make the best possible decision. So you have these criteria for measuring good, but there's no scientific or no philosophical way to choose a single best way to weight all those alternatives. So different people could place different weights on each of those scores, and they would come to different conclusions about what's the best option. So I think when you talk about good behavior, typically you'd be interested in multiple dimensions of what it means to be good. Jess has done a good job of mentioning a bunch of different traditions and a bunch of different ways in which people have thought about defining good. And what you could do is you could just make a list of all these different ways to say what it means to be good, and you can assign scores based on each of those objectives and then weight them. But then different people could assign different weights, and they would come to different conclusions about what the best thing to do is. And there's, as far as I know, no real way to resolve those differences in a manner that's philosophically unique or even scientifically unique. So in that sense, I think that's part of the reason why a lot of people seem to think that value is subjective in this way, that there's no objective scientific way to settle the matter of what is the best.
The outcome will define what is the best. You mentioned the outcome of whatever it is. If you built one of each power plant, which one performed the best after 20 years, then that one would be voted as the best. It's always, in my opinion, it always ends up being what is the outcome, the final criteria once it's done. You know, you can go around
people disagree about the outcomes as well. So you can, even if you're not taking a decision, even if you're just evaluating the state of affairs, people will disagree about the value of the thing. So even at the level of outcomes, there's no objective, unique solution to these types of questions. And I think that's what people, when they try to say value is subjective, the good is subjective, they're trying to get at that there's no unique truth in saying what is the best.
Well,
but then you just have to make a decision and not talk and talk and talk. Make a decision and then see what happens. Otherwise, you're going to be sitting here. No, I don't mean now. Sometimes people just spend too much bloody time talking and then make a bad decision and then see what the outcome is.
I want to get to the good part, because like a lot of people get quite upset about this notion that there's no final, single, unique, correct answer to what's the best. And yeah, good enough you can go for, and good enough should be good enough for everyone. But like people disagree about what's good enough too. But then when people try to push back against relativism and subjectivism, they want to say like, no, there are these universal moral truths, and if you violate them, really bad things can happen. And those people will typically resort to talking about bad behavior, because there are objective scientific criteria for saying when an option should not be taken. And economists talk about Pareto inefficient or dominated alternatives. So one alternative is dominated by another alternative if it's at least as bad, or usually it's defined the other way around. So one alternative dominates another alternative if it's at least as good on all of the criteria and better on at least one criteria. So if there's no sense in which one alternative is worse than the other alternative, and there's at least one sense in which it's better, it's objectively wrong to take the worst alternative, or the relatively worse alternative. So people, when they try to say there are objective truths in morality, they typically point to bad behavior, because it's fairly easy to think of things that are clearly dominated by other alternatives, and they say, see, that's obviously wrong, you shouldn't do that. I think that sort of establishes the notion that maybe there is some sort of universal ground. But the conversations keep going, because just because you can say there's objective grounds for saying someone's wrong, that doesn't solve this problem of different people having different priorities and the single best solutions being open to being an open problem.
I think that Peter touched on something just now where something that I've been trying to get to as well, is you offer choices, I guess. If you could, rather than trying to define one universal truth, or one, the only way, there's only one solution to this, you identify the fact that there are multiple solutions and you account for what they could be. So it is still technically packaging them up into what those options are, but you're offering up then multiple choice. So you're going, okay, cool, so we've got these 5 different options of these 5 different truths. Which one is most aligned with yours? And then you've got this range, and on the range you can find out where people would fit within that, and they can then also make the choice of which to follow and which not to. Possibly idealistic, I have been accused of being such, but, but I mean, I think
no, like when that's possible, that's a good solution. I like that. It's not always possible, but like when sometimes it is, and often it is, and yeah. What also is sometimes possible is to design an alternative that's dominant. So it's just better on everyone's criteria in every way. And then people take the dominant alternative. I know he's a bit full of it often, but Elon Musk got close to doing that with his Tesla cars, where he figured like people will choose the electric car if it's better on every criteria on which people evaluate cars. It has to be faster, it has to be cheaper, it has to be more comfortable, it has to be safer. It has to be better in everything. And then people will take the electric car and they won't look back on it.
I'm a petrol head. I want to ride. I want to feel the engine, because then and now it's becoming too appealing to my senses. Driving electric cars.
Maybe they'll make rumbly electric cars. Didn't they do that already?
That's exactly it.
They'll make a 4-stroke. They'll make a 4-stroke electric car that like growls when you drive it.
But remember, that goes back to the beginning of the conversation. It's how I was brought up, how I was started. Was it my religion, what did you say, religion, race, creed, whatever the case is, how people put into their groups.
Anybody got some more questions or comments? I think, Francois, as always, thank you very much. Peter, great to meet you. And we're gonna have some more thought-provoking topics.
I'll be on them all.
Yeah.
Great.
Jaren, anybody else? Any other questions from some people that we haven't heard from before? Daniel, anything to weigh in on?
It means I'm doing bad behavior, so I'm going to shut up.
No. Just as the moderator, I'm trying to give other people a chance to get good behavior.
No, I'm anthropological, so obviously I'm very much into this context matters. When Jess and I were talking about it, I could not shut up about context. It was really all I was about. I'm one of these types who is very content not reaching an answer regarding all of this. Yeah. I don't believe there is a good or anything. I just think that people do, and then culture defines meaning to these arbitrary actions. Maybe that's a bit nihilistic, but...
That's a bit. How old are you? 20? 21?
I'm 21.
Well, with a PhD, yeah, that's spoken like a true 21-year-old with a PhD. Anyway, great to hear from you, Daniel. Any other comments?